Lone Rider here, and I want to read something to you. This is from a piece in Newsweek, March 22nd, 1965, about the college rebellions on the West Coast in Berkeley. And it says, quote, talking about the students, quote, they rally over issues, not philosophies, and seem unable to formulate or sustain a systemized political theory of society, either from the left or the right. Today's student seeks to find himself through what he does, not what he thinks. Now, this is something that I think is very interesting because it hasn't, not only has it not changed, it's gotten worse. That description could aptly describe any of the gun control advocates that have emerged in the last week or two following the shooting in Parkland, Florida, especially the younger people. Anybody who's seen clips, or if you've had the stomach to watch the whole thing, of the CNN town hall that followed the mass murder in Florida, it was an interesting spectacle. If you could step outside of it and just look at it abstractly, when you look at it, considering the context that this is what's shaping a major debate on a political issue in this country, it's frightening. You essentially had people getting up there who didn't really know or care to know anything, and were just shouting at the top of their lungs and rallying over issues rather than ideas is certainly an apt description. But it's also an apt description that they seek to find some kind of meaning in immediate action rather than in any kind of long-term thinking or planning or solutions. The problem is immediate action may be emotionally gratifying, but unless you have some kind of idea to direct it, what you essentially end up with is the political equivalent of a lynch mob. People are upset and they feel like they should be doing something. For many people, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily follow that then whatever it is they do, that's meaningful, or that's going to have a positive impact, or that it's not even going to make things worse. The fact to say that, well, somebody's upset and they want to do something, couldn't that description be applied to any drunken mob? Yeah. So I'm not entirely surprised about this, though, because it's something that's been a long time coming in this country. And it's essentially the result of two things. One, the tilt of intellectuals towards anti-intellectualism, and then the tilt of everybody else away from the intellectuals in response. At some point, this is to put it in an extreme nutshell, but basically there was a backlash against reason and against all the outgrowths of the Enlightenment. People got frustrated either with societal problems or with intellectual issues that they were unable to resolve, and they basically said, the hell with all that. Rather than move forward and try to find solutions, let's just declare that there is no truth. Nobody can know anything, and everything's relative. In a nutshell, that's essentially what happened. Now, that's not true for everybody, and that's certainly not true for all the intellectuals, but it was true for enough of them in various ways, and there were different factions also within. But it was true for enough of them that the average person, when he looked at the intellectuals, the people that shaped the culture, the college professors, the writers, the thinkers, the people in media and entertainment and the arts, they saw either something that was just confusing and impossible to make sense of, or they saw something that didn't offer anything of value, and so they turned away from it. And so for quite a while in this country, we've had an anti-intellectual attitude. The problem is that, in its most basic sense, philosophy is about making sense of the world around you. Um, there are bad philosophies and there are good philosophies and there are middling philosophies. Some offer some benefits, some don't make any sense. But if you completely disregard the arena of ideas and say, well, there's nothing there, then you really are left with no standard by which to judge conduct, no way to, determine what it is you should do or how, and essentially no guide in terms of how society should be organized or even how your own personal life should be organized. And one of the things that I find quite telling about this modern gun control movement, um, and we can essentially say, let's say gun control since the Newtown shooting in Connecticut, because that's when it really started. Um, some people might argue after the shooting in Las Vegas. It's kind of hard to put a point on it because, um, the gun control agenda, its modern ascendancy really started in the late 80s and early 90s. And, then in the mid 90s, we saw a lot of momentum for it. And also a lot of the myths that are still with us today about guns and gun laws and gun violence um, that have now become so ingrained. When you point out that they're myths, a lot of people don't even understand what you're talking about. Um, the idea that, for example, a semi-automatic rifle is the same thing as a military issue assault rifle capable of fully automatic or multi-round burst fire, it's factually incorrect. The two are not the same. There's no debating that. It's a fact. Okay? You can look at it and say, well, okay, what should we do about that fact? How should we, incorporate that into how we formulate policy? But to sit there and try and say, well, okay, that's what you think, but what I think is, no, it's a fact. It's as much a fact as that there's a door here. It's real. It exists. If I close it right now, it's going to break my fingers because it's here and it's a physical object. This is the problem with abandoning philosophy, with abandoning the intellectual life, essentially, of a country to charlatans or to, whomever. Just saying, oh, well, the hell with all that shit. Is that you're then left with, well, how do you evaluate ideas? How do you evaluate the world around you even? And I don't think it's a coincidence that on a tide of, anti-intellectualism, essentially, that's been spilling into the culture over the last 100 years, I don't think it's a coincidence that, now we're at the point where, people are willing to debate. It's like, well, okay, you say that's not an assault rifle, but to me it is. No, it either is or it isn't. Okay? It either is or it isn't. But that only, that only applies, I guess, if you have some kind of objective standard of reality. Now this gets back to philosophy. There's different levels. The traditional breakdown, as ascribed to Aristotle, is metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and then politics. Politics, in other words, is only the surface phenomena. All the underlying stuff is really what's important. And briefly, in an incredibly simplistic overview here, because I don't have a lot of that much time. Metaphysics deals with knowledge of the world, of the actual world. Epistemology deals with the theory of knowledge, so how you determine that knowledge. Ethics deals with essentially what you do with that knowledge about the world, how you assess right and wrong and what you should do and shouldn't do and so forth. And then politics, of course, is the result of the practical application of all of those things in terms of societal interactions, types of governments, types of societies, etc. Essentially, the politics is what you get after you add everything together. And, if you have a bad metaphysics or a bad epistemology or a flawed ethics, you're going to get an incoherent politics or a self-destructive politics or a bad politics. What we're seeing here is essentially the politics of anti-intellectualism. When it gets to the point where you point out to somebody, a gun control advocate is, for example, talking about, well, we need to ban these semi-automatic assault rifles. And you point out, just to let you know, assault rifles refers to fully automatic weapons. Those are already heavily restricted. What you're talking about are semi-automatic only rifles, essentially civilian rifles. They're not military style. They're not assault rifles. Oh, that's just what you think. No, there's a functional difference in how they operate. One fires one bullet at a time for one pull of the trigger. The other one pull of the trigger can empty the magazine. If you don't believe me, pick one up and shoot it. You'll see the difference. In fact, if you don't believe me, go out and try to get your hands on a fully automatic assault rifle at a regular gun store. Good luck with that. And if you somehow manage to get your hands on one, good luck explaining to the authorities when they come to arrest you for illegal possession of a fully automatic weapon that, well, the difference between semi and fully automatic is only in the head of the policeman. To you, it has a different meaning and a different truth. Good luck with that. Right? Now, there's a very real difference. The problem is we're at a point in our society where you can't even discuss factual discrepancies because this isn't about facts. This is about emotion. This is about people operating at in an anti-intellectual manner, and essentially at a purely, emotional level. You look at something like that CNN town hall, and you have all these people screaming and calling each other names, and when somebody, for example, like what was his name, Rubio, the Republican congressman or whatever, tries to, people are screaming at him and shouting at him, and he tries to explain his viewpoint, and they just shout over him. It's like, well, okay, so they're not actually interested in having a debate, are they? Essentially, they just want a ritual scapegoating ceremony. For those of you who don't know, the term scapegoat in modern parlance means a person who's picked to be blamed for something that goes wrong or something that's bad. So, for example, you might use it in the sense of, when the office failed to meet its quarterly earnings, Bob was the manager's scapegoat. I mean, if this was an English class, let's say. Here's the problem. What's the origin of the term scapegoat? Well, it comes from the phrase escape goat. And in the original ancient ceremony, 2 goats were selected. I don't know why they picked goats. I guess they were a common livestock at the time. 2 goats were selected. One was taken off to be ritually slaughtered. They didn't really have an ASPCA back then. So, there was a lot of this type of stuff that went on. But anyway, one was taken off to be ritually slaughtered. The other one was symbolically designated as carrying the sins of the people, and it was released to run off into the wilderness and carry those sins away. That's the origin of the term scapegoat. And essentially, a scapegoating ceremony, in a literal sense, was a ritual process through which a community cleansed itself. not dissimilar essentially to what went on at CNN. You even had two scapegoats there. You had the young spokeswoman from the NRA, and you had Marco Rubio. The difference is that neither of them was ritually slaughtered, although symbolically there was a lot of denouncement going on. But nobody's blood was shed, thank goodness. But I guess we could look at a politics that's filled with this level of vitriol and this level of nonsense. And wonder, when you abandon reason, when you abandon logic, when you abandon philosophy and ethics, when you abandon any conception of what reality is, and reality is just determined by your emotions and by your feelings, which is apparently the level at which many of these young people are operating, and worse, at which many of their handlers in the media are operating. I understand if a distraught 16-year-old doesn't know what they're talking about. But does Katie Couric? I mean, seriously, that's the problem here. It's that the people who should know better either don't or are acting as if they don't. And so, yes, it's understandable that a bunch of distraught kids who just went through a terrifying experience, surviving a massacre, it's understandable that they're going to be, all worked up, and they're going to feel like they need to do something. And that's understandable. What's not understandable is why the media is letting their hysteria drive it to hysteria and then shaping the debate in our culture about this. Why are we presented with the demand, the ultimatum essentially, that if we don't accede to everything these terrified out of their mind young people say, we're some kind of heartless fiends? The only thing I can think of is that, I keep hearkening back to that quote from the 60s where, they rally around issues. They have no real ideology or beliefs to guide them. They're just sort of reacting at an emotional level with the need to do something. That sounds exactly like what's going on here. And the problem is, when you're operating at that kind of a level, it doesn't lead to good policy. It doesn't lead to well thought out policy. Indeed, it prevents anything from being well thought out. And essentially, you have people like running amok. There is no gun control debate. What there is an angry mob running around screaming its head off. And I understand when people are really upset and they've survived a tragedy. For a while, you're like, okay, just let them vent. At some point, you have to start saying, though, okay, you've been venting for a while now. Are we going to get back to normal? Because this can't be the new normal. It's not possible to have a society survive